everyone, and welcome to the round glass review for the Canon 135mm f2.0 FDn lens. This is an exciting lens to use, so let's jump right into this review. This lens was released in 1980, I believe it was May 1980, and I couldn't find when it was produced until. However, it may well have been available new until the FD lens production ended in 1995. Typical lens uses for this lens in particular include portraits and some sports work, but I'm going to tell you that a sleeper use with this lens that I admittedly did not have a chance to try would be astrophotography. I have used a 135 f2.8 for astrophotography before, and the focal length is quite good for many astrophotography uses, especially if you have a solid astro tracker. For your bottom line up front, Canon indicates that this lens delivers excellent results because of the distribution of power in the lens system and the focus on spherical aberration correction. Thinking of the aperture placement like the center of the lens, this lens is very front-heavy and distributes most of the image-correcting work to the elements up front. For a bunch of information that you could find on your own, but that I've put all into one place here for you, the focal length and AOV are 135mm and 18 degrees on full frame, with an equivalent of 207mm and 12 degrees on aps-c. Aperture range is 2 through a staggeringly small 32. The element and group count are 6 and 5. The design type is, well, it appears to be anyway, an Erno star. Filter size is 72mm, the closest focus is 1.3 meters, which in the US is 1/15.6 millionth of an imperial measurement world tour unit. The imperial measurement world tour unit is the distance that, laid end to end, would stretch from here to Liberia and then to Myanmar, and that is 15,578,653.846 times the length of this lens's minimum focus distance. The drive type is manual focus only, the native mount is Canon New FD, dimensions are 78 by 90.4mm, and the weight is 670 grams, and believe me, this lens will let you know that it's there. Here's my top tip for this lens. Do not use a speed booster. This lens suffers exceptional field curvature and sagittal astigmatism when a speed booster is placed behind it. Stopping down does a little to rectify these issues, but not a whole lot. The examples here that I'm showing you show this lens being used with a speed booster in aps-c format, and these samples should convince you that doing this is a bad idea. Obviously, for my next tip, this is a portrait lens. That said, use it for things other than portraits. The minimum aperture of f32 means that, with a macro adapter or bellows, you can obtain relatively suitable depths of field with close-up work and macro work. And as a bonus, you can also do that with a suitable working distance for subjects that you don't want to spook. Lastly, when you use this lens as a portrait lens, set your subject close to you, close to the nearest focus point if you can, and have a background that is at least 10 to 20 feet behind them. So basically, don't stand your subject immediately in front of a wall. The subject background separation that I recommend here, when this lens is shot at a wider aperture, will deliver pleasing background blur and color and tone blending characteristics that make for stunning and lovely portraits. This is a low-level Seidel analysis, and we'll use this section to identify things like spherical aberration, coma, astigmatism, field curvature, and distortion where they're possible from this test. If you're curious to gain more than a 101 level understanding, as this video is going to provide, check out the handprint.com link in the reference section of the video's description. So let's start with a couple of blurry balls photos. This first one focuses the lens at infinity and photographs point source lights, which honestly they're just fairy lights of different colors that are closer than the focus point. In fact, much closer than the focus point. In this photo, we learn two interesting things about this lens. The first is that one of the blurry areas shows onion rings. This means that at least one element was made with a hot poured molded glass piece instead of a ground surface glass piece. Onion rings typically mean that there's an aspherical element to correct spherical aberrations. Interestingly, I could find exactly nothing in any of the Canon literature that I own, nor any that I found online, that indicated this lens includes an aspherical element. Usually that would be a major marketing point, especially back in the 80s. Canon's museum website for this lens does indicate that it has, quotes, sufficient correction of spherical aberration, end quote. This second photo focuses the lens at the closest focus point, wide open, with some blurry lights behind the focus plane. This photo doesn't need a markup as it confirms what we saw already, cat-eye blurring that indicates mechanical vignette and onion rings in the blurry balls. Now, let's get interesting. Here is the dots test chart that I adapted from Lonely Speck. We'll zoom into the center at 100% and then go around each corner to see what the blurry areas tell us. The orange triangle thing will point to the image center on the corner shots. This test reveals some significant surprises. We do see some spherical aberration, though insignificant, and I argue of a nature that would make blurry areas in this lens's images meld together more pleasingly. I didn't call this out specifically on the image, but check out the 4 dots on the right side for faint hints of that spherical aberration. I agree with the Canon marketing materials that spherical aberration is very well controlled with this lens. It's not eliminated, but it's controlled. The center points show chromatic aberration right out of the gate, and it's not an aberration that improves with distance from the center. Instead, the coma in this lens just hides it. The coma is strong in this image by less than 25% of the way from the center point to the image's edge, and it's perceptible about 12% of the way from the center to the edge. I'm not going to lie, that is a Ramstein-grade performance for coma. Would you like to see the coma get stronger? Let's take a look at the top left corner where the coma and chromatic aberration smear together into something that looks like a paintball hit a black wall at a shallow angle. In the top right, coma takes on a much blunter shape, and in a moment we'll see why. The bottom right shows some distinct astigmatism in the coma. This was hinted at in the top right coma smear, but comes out of hiding like a werewolf in the full moon here. We'll round out here in the bottom left for fun and see a coma smear that looks like a blurry shuttlecock. Here's the key takeaway that this section should give you. This lens, from a technical perspective, is as flawed as a pancake cooked in cast iron with no butter on high heat. But if the images taken with this lens in this video don't demonstrate an inarguably strong performance for real-world use, then we're looking at this lens in completely different ways, and I am the one who is right here. This lens performs very well as a using lens, terribly as a testing lens. This lens looks like an Erno star to me, though admittedly the differences between the Erno star and the decedent sonar design at a glance can be hard to pinpoint with certainty without a much keener eye for optical designs than I have. One thing about Erno stars and the related family of designs is they deliver good speed. In fact, miraculous speed for the times in which the designs originally arrived, paired with good optical performance. That makes these ideal for portraits. This should be especially true on large format where there are some f2 options on 4x5 for Erno star designs. Erno stars also, as a general statement with, I'm sure, some exceptions to the contrary, tend to deliver images with some quite palpable optical flaws. For me, these flaws are what add character to the images, and I, personally, like the images I've gotten from my Erno star lenses. Anyway, if you enjoy images from Erno star design lenses, the next couple of years will have some real treats in store for you, including the Nikkor Series E 100mm f2.8, yes, an Erno star, and the Komura 100mm f1.8, though this latter one is still a long way out. Breathing, when flipped from one photo to another, is noticeable. However, when judging breathing in video from closest focus to 2 meters, which is 0.7 meters beyond the closest focus point, and that's a focus rack that is fairly similar to how this lens would likely be used in video, breathing is not intrusive, and the slight change in magnification of the 3 styrene heads is, to me, quite pleasing and natural and could emphasize a change in subject priority in a motion shot. The aperture is stepped with 8 blades, but because this is an FD mount lens and FD mount adapters have rings that can turn the aperture on and off, you can use the ring on your FD mount adapter to make this lens perform like a preset lens with a stepless aperture when using a mirrorless camera for video. The front element is non-rotating, but it does move in and out 17 millimeters, 12.6% of the lens's focal length, and the focus ring itself moves forward about 1 millimeter as it racks across the 270-degree focal throw. Focus damping is highly pleasing with a near-perfect amount of resistance and very smooth milling on the focusing helical. The autofocus effect on audio is NA, as this is a manual focus lens only. In terms of on the focal plane, sharpness is very good. This is not by any stretch the sharpest 135mm lens I've ever used, but I argue that a lens this fast from the 80s would not be and should not be. This was, despite the way it was used in this video, primarily intended as a portrait lens. As a general rule, lenses intended for portraits benefit from being slightly softer, as a hyper-sharp lens will accentuate and highlight every flaw in a person's face. A softer lens will mask minor flaws and create a more flattering rendition. One very strong aspect of this lens is that when shooting at the widest, or nearly the widest apertures, the focal plane remains very sharp, and the transition from sharp to blurry areas is exceptionally pleasing. Build quality is exceptional, and that's in keeping with Canon's high-end lenses across history. Contrast is largely medium-specific. With film, and especially RAW files, this lens is a bit flatter than many other 135 lenses. High-contrast films benefit from this lens here, and for you film shooters out there, that will be important to know. For a RAW workflow, this lens has a contrast level that is near ideal for post-editing when you want to make small to moderate contrast tweaks for your preferred image aesthetic. I'm going to start by apologizing for bumping the hanging lights between f8 and f11 in these star point test shots. But the point of this series of images is to try and convey what should still be discernible, which is the character of the star points created by the aperture. Aperture stars start to manifest in a noticeable way by f4, and to my eye they're pleasing and defined 8-point stars by f8. I also would say that the star quality peaks at f16 to f22, as the stars do kind of start to shrink for f32. Out-of-focus areas for portrait subjects are quite nice at the wider apertures. The flaws that we saw exhibited in the Seidel analysis section combine to make this lens a captivating portrait lens. You can also obtain pleasing out-of-focus blur for general shooting, but that's not this lens's main goal. Distortion is beautifully controlled in this lens, with no distortion that I can discern in the graph paper. Light loss is apparent at f2 and gone by f5.6 when focused at infinity and photographing a white screen. Light loss never returns through f32, and the even illumination across the frame at those apertures is quite remarkable. Flare and ghosting are unknowns, as this lens includes a built-in lens hood. I tend not to go out of my way to test flare and ghosting with lenses that have built-in hoods because you should be using that hood. Balance with cameras is nice if you have a heavy camera like a Canon film SLR or a heavier mirrorless body. The glass elements in this lens are very front-loaded, and that does make this lens very front-heavy, and noticeably so on lighter cameras. The Canon FDn 135 f2 is one of my favorite 35mm lenses, and the way it creates images is simply stunning. I like this lens best when focused close and shot at wider apertures. This lens also shines when the image composition provides a lot of negative space with interesting background colors and tones well behind your focal plane. This lens truly shines and does its best work in that singular setting: close subject, distant background, large aperture. Like a lot of the lenses in this series, this one's captivating images stem from the manner it performs, obviously, and that performance is dictated by the significant technical flaws that it delivers. That said, knowing what we know now about this lens's chromatic aberration, coma, and astigmatism, do you hate it? If you went back and looked at the first 10 photos in this video again, would you like them less than the first run-through because of the way this lens performed in technical review? So here's the bottom line of this lens. This is a captivating 135 that holds up today in terms of delivering incredible, flattering, and eye-catching portraits. This will continue to be true of this lens for years to come as well. In terms of fast 135 portrait lenses, this is not just hard to beat. This lens is, for me, the standard bearer.